At about 5 in the morning we arrived in Pune, which is exactly where we were about a week ago, and had to wait about half an hour for the next bus. But luckily it was the right time to see the sunrise over Lake Titicaca. We then got back on the bus and it was about another 6 hours before we finally made it to La Paz. We checked straight into Skyline Hostel and basically spent the rest of the day catching up on sleep and eating greasy pizza. The next day was even less interesting because we were both in bed all day with food poisoning, and to top it off, it turns out there's a music school opposite our room and they were practicing all day. But we did manage to make it out for a burger and a steak for dinner. The next morning we still felt pretty bad, but we didn't want to waste the day, so we spent 3 hours on a walking tour of La Paz. We started in San Pedro Square, and the building you can see here is a prison. It's self-regulated, so they have their own sort of government inside, and they all have jobs within there, including cocaine production, because they all have to pay rent to live there, and it ranges from $80 to $3,000 a month, depending on what type of room they have, and some of them even have their families living in there with them. There's a book called Marching Powder written about this prison, but it's banned in Bolivia because the government don't want people knowing about how corrupt the place is. We moved on from the square to the Witches Market, where, as you can see, they like to hang up dead baby alpacas, and apparently dead piglets too. People buy them to use as offerings to Pachamama, or Mother Earth, along with these multicoloured packs called Ekekos offerings, all meant for luck, protection and prosperity. We then visited the Basilica of San Francisco, built in 1548. The last stop was Plaza Murillo, named after this revolutionary hero who was hanged by the Spanish on this very lamppost. The square has been the stage for countless protests and revolutions, and if you look closely you can still see bullet holes in some of the surrounding buildings. The next day we both felt we could go on a day trip without pooing ourselves, so we'd booked onto one of the most famous tours in Bolivia, biking down Death Road, or in Espanol, Camino de la Muerte. It has this name because it was once considered the world's most dangerous road, with 300 deaths a year on average. It links La Paz to Coroico in the Yungas region, descending from the Andes at about 4,650 metres above sea level, down to the jungle, which is around 1,200 metres. So you're starting at high altitude mountains and finishing in the warm jungle, so it's one of the most dramatic altitude drops in the world. The whole route was about 65 kilometres long.
A new highway links the two areas, but half of the original road still exists, which consisted of a 3.5 metre wide gravel path with very few safety railings, to 500 metre drops on your left hand side, and on your right hand side were steep cliffs prone to landslides due to the mining in the area. Just remember, this used to be a road for two-way traffic, including trucks and coaches, travelling daytime and nighttime. You soon reach one of the most infamous points on the Death Road, which you'll have probably seen before if you've seen the Top Gear Bolivia special. This section was only 1 car wide, and in 1983 an overloaded bus carrying 100 people lost control and fell down the cliff, killing everybody on board. And if you look closely you can still see the bus down there. For perspective, this was our support bus, which was carrying our spare bags and emergency supplies, and you can see how small it looks in comparison to this massive cliff face. We continued down the road along the many twists and turns, and as we started to duck below the clouds, the views of the valley were absolutely beautiful. And every 10 minutes or so we'd stop to take in the views, which was needed because even with the full suspension bike, the route absolutely destroyed your wrists and forearms. We continued on, passing under waterfalls as we went, until eventually the road surface started to even out, and we could go a little bit faster without having to endure as much crippling pain. After about another hour of riding, we arrived into the town of Yolosa, where we had a buffet lunch and got to sit back and relax in a very mild temperatured swimming pool. And since we'd not died on the death road, we treated ourselves to some beers to celebrate. After a few hours we reboarded our bus and started our journey back to La Paz on the new tarmacked highway, which still had the massive drops from before, but had 2 lanes and safety barriers. And the whole ride back I was on the verge of pooing myself, which was in no way enjoyable. We started the next morning with a full English breakfast, then had a nice relaxing day where we chilled in the room and did some planning for our upcoming campervan expedition. In the afternoon we had a wander out and were lucky enough to see the famous Bolivian zebras who wait at traffic crossings and distract the drivers to stop them running people over. Although they did leave me in the middle of the road in oncoming traffic. We'd booked in that afternoon to watch the famous Cholita wrestling, When we arrived, we were given free drinks and popcorn, as well as a tiny souvenir for coming. We were then given these Jimmy Neutron football rattles, and we sat back, grabbed a beer, and waited for the show to begin. Cholita Wrestling came about when a group of domestic abuse survivors were looking for new outlets to go along with their therapy. It got so famous there was even a film about it in the Sundance Film Festival. Cholitas come out to the ring dancing in their traditional outfits, and pick handsome men from the audience to come up and dance with them. The first match was very high paced and got a lot of positive feedback from the audience. The next match was filled with controversy, with head biting from one of the opponents, along with some swift knees to the midsection, one-sidedness and hair pulling from the referee, which was highly controversial, and then at one point the ref just started beating her up. Fortunately, the Cholita started building some momentum and started getting her own back on the crooked referee and her dodgy opponent, which the crowd really appreciated.
Come on, Andy, kick his head in!
The match then turned into a brawl in the audience, right next to where we were sitting. Then all of a sudden they were fighting in the balconies, which culminated in this massive cross-body jump from the second floor, which was absolutely ridiculous to watch. Eventually Annie, the good Cholita, won by pinning her opponent with the unconscious referee. The final match of the night was a luchador versus a Cholita, which started with an outrageous outfit change. The Cholita got the upper hand in the fight with some beautiful technical wrestling. But the dirty tactics of the luchador meant he started to pull ahead, and he even took my full can of beer and threw it in her face, not even offering to replace it at the end. What an absolute bully. Eventually the Cholita pulled back the momentum and won the match for the good guys. We finished the evening with some well overdue tacos.
I was up and out the next morning, riding solo. Jack was on day 5 of what we thought was food poisoning, so while he stayed in bed, I went out for the day. After about a 3-hour drive, we arrived at Juricota Lagoon. This point's around 4,730 metres above sea level, and it's where the 12k trek starts from. I was the only English-speaking person on the trip, so my Spanish was being tested all day, and honestly I think that was more exhausting than the hike. We got about 20 minutes in and someone already dropped out due to altitude sickness, so while they headed back to the van we all carried on, where we reached Slovenia Lagoon, which is called that because it sits below Pico Austria, one of the main mountains round here. After about 4 hours we finally reached our destination, Bentanani Glacier, sitting at 5,080 metres above sea level, and this was the first glacier that I've ever seen up close, so it was pretty cool. Glaciers are massive, persistent bodies of dense ice that form over many years from compacted snow. And scientists reckon that the Andean glaciers, including this one, were formed during the last ice age, which was roughly 10 to 20,000 years ago. And there used to be many more glaciers here, but due to global warming they don't exist anymore. And in 50 years Bentanani might not even exist. This glacier also acts as a natural water reservoir that feeds streams and rivers that supply drinking water for nearby villages and towns in the Yungas region, and also provides a nice freezer for your alcohol. As we walked further towards it we noticed lots of blue lines in the glacier, and these are areas of very dense ice and meltwater channels. And here you can see tons of icicles. Some are dripping, which show that the glacier is still actively melting and feeding into the lagoons and streams below. After we'd taken our pictures, it was time to head back down, which was much easier than the walk up, and only took about 2 hours.
While Beth was outside looking at the glaciers, I was inside looking at a Bolivian doctor's office, which I thought would be a quick in-out affair. They ended up giving me blood tests and making me poo in this small plastic cup, and then I was treated to a lunch of crackers and tea. After being charged £150 and being told it was just a virus and there's nothing they could do, I walked back via this very smelly river, and then we went out for this beautiful steak meal in downtown La Paz, which I couldn't eat due to my illness. The next day my symptoms had not reduced, but we'd booked in to go for a really nice hike, and I wasn't going to spend another day in bed. I dosed up on Imodium and we hit the road. Today we were aiming to reach 5,320 metres above sea level by climbing a mountain called Pico Austria. We'd have to cover about 11 kilometres and climb an altitude by about 900 metres. Our first stop off was at a lake called Chiacuta, which had these magnificent views of the surrounding mountains. From the freezing temperatures and cold winds, it probably wouldn't have been a good place for a dip. As we continued up the mountain, it even started snowing. The hike was fairly relaxed to start. We had plenty of breaks, took in the amazing views, and continued up the mountain paths, which were a little bit rocky and very, very steep. In the distance, the peak of Pico Austria started to come into view, but it seemed very, very far away, and the higher we climbed, the more difficult it got to breathe, and the more uneven and rocky the ground got. Eventually we reached El Paso, a point between two of the mountains, and the views again were absolutely insane. Fortunately, these views also covered the lake of Bentanani, where Beth visited the day before, so technically I'd been there as well. After 3 hours of uphill walking, we made it to the top of Pico Austria, where the weather was clear enough that we could see the whole way to Lake Titicaca. Strangely, there was no wind at the top of the mountain, so we took out our strange-looking packed lunches and had a well-deserved feed, whilst looking out over the other peaks. After some photo opportunities, it was time to head back down, which as you can imagine was a lot easier on the lungs than the way up. But the large bits of rock made it super slippy, and as usual I was the one to take a tumble. Within an hour we were back down on the stable ground, and the lake came back into view, which meant we were near the end. On the way back we passed a ridiculous amount of llamas, as well as donkeys who were carrying supplies, which were being used to build a trout farm for the local community, and after passing them the bus came into view, which meant we were finished. That evening we ventured to La Paz's English pub, where the food was so bad it made us miss home more.
The next day was our last full day in La Paz, and we kicked the day off with a bit of shopping. We'd been after a couple of warm jumpers for the Patagonia section, so we bought some lovely genuine Patagonia jackets that were really fluffy and had all of the zips. And here's Jack styling his out. After this we decided to check out the cable car system. La Paz has the largest public transit cable car system in the world, with a total route length of around 33 kilometres, serving 10 lines and 26 stations. And it only cost us about 72p to do a massive loop of the city. We also got off at one point to have a little ice cream, where I also saw a cute dog, and there were also loads of old trains here, which Jack loved, and I enjoyed. We then jumped back on the cable cars and continued our loop, with the whole thing taking about 2 hours. And here you'll see some jagged rock formations. These are sandstone spires sculpted over thousands of years by wind and water erosion. La Paz itself sits in a deep canyon carved out by the Chocayapu River, and that's why the surrounding landscape is so unusual. And this video here is a cemetery, one of many. A lot of the buildings within it are 3 stories high, and cram as many remains as they can get in there. We got back to La Paz and had time for another steak, and this dinner was about £4 each, by the way. And then it was time for another night bus. This one left at about 9:30 at night, and then got in at around 8:30 in the morning. And this one was going from La Paz to Potosí.
After a fairly unpleasant night bus with not a lot of sleep, we arrived in the city of Potosí, where we were greeted by some unusual sounds in the bus station, which was people trying to flog tickets to essentially an empty building. In the 17th century, this was one of the most wealthy cities in the world. Sitting at about 4,100 metres above sea level, it's also one of the highest cities in the world. We checked into our hotel, which came equipped with our own personal heaters. Then after some much needed rest, set out on a tour of the famous silver mines. Our first stop was the miners' market, where we saw typical mining clothes, which was essentially tracksuits. Then we did some classic dynamite shopping, as this is the only city in the world you can legally buy it. After buying some other gifts for the miners, we put on these paint and decorators outfits, prepared ourselves to head into the mine. Potosí is classed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in danger, as Cerro Rico, the mountain, has become porous from all the mining, which still carries on to this day, and will become a bit more apparent once you see the videos from inside the mine. The miners themselves are all essentially self-employed and work for larger organisations called cooperatives. The miners will extract the ore, then the profits will be split between them and the cooperative, depending on how much equipment they've borrowed from them. The miners themselves were deeply religious, with their spirituality being a blend of Catholicism and traditional Andean beliefs, such as the Pachamama, or Mother Earth, to whom they'd provide yearly llama sacrifices. The further we went into the mine, the more apparent it was that this was not the Yorkshire Coal Mining Museum. The miners worked really long days in very bad conditions, and would chew hundreds of coca leaves to keep themselves focused, and to work without feeling hungry. The mine shafts went kilometres deep into the mountainside, and were set over multiple levels. Since there were multiple mining operations in the area, cave-ins were common. They also had the issue of hazardous chemicals, which were found naturally in the rocks. They were primarily looking for silver, zinc, copper and tin in these seams of varying sizes. They would use dynamite to blow sections of the mine up, load it into wheelbarrows, then transport it to the trucks waiting outside the mine, often transporting thousands of kilos of ore, whilst drinking litres of fizzy drink, and consuming bottles of 96% alcohol. We were then introduced to El Tío, who was the lord of the underworld in Bolivian mining culture, considered both the protector and the destroyer. So the miners believed it was important to keep on the right side of him, by providing him with gifts, including coca leaves and that really strong alcohol. For our safety and future prosperity, we made a toast to El Tío.
Oh, strong. For me, it was very soft. Maybe this one is pure alcohol or not pure alcohol.
And then, for cultural reasons, we had to have another shot. To prove just how strong this alcohol was, he lit his own finger on fire and then lit a cigarette from it. He then presented the lit cigarette to El Tío as an offering. Just keep in mind you can't take mobile phones down the Yorkshire Coal Mining Museum. After paying our last respects to El Tío, it was time to head back above ground, which we were pretty happy about because the mine was so dangerous. Outside of the mine, we took in the views of Sierra Rico, along with this really matted stray mining dog. Then it was time to head to the refinery, where the ore was broken down into its component parts. The building was filled with different kinds of machinery. First broke the material down into smaller pieces, ground that material down for processing, then using chemicals extracted the important materials from the ore, to produce this material that was sent abroad to separate the component parts. After the mining tour was finished, we had a wander around the city of Potosí, which was actually a really beautiful place. Then we finished the day with a local delicacy, a meat, wheat and potato soup with a volcanic rock dropped in the middle of it.
The next morning we were up early because we were already going to leave Potosí. So we got to the bus station for 9 AM, ready to catch a 4-hour bus to get to Uyuni, out in the sticks. We arrived just in time for check-in, but forgot to film the hotel. And once we dropped our bags, we had a look for a coffee shop. So we had a quick drink and some scram, then slid to the only attraction, another train museum, which, as you can see, Jack was very happy about. We spent about an hour here looking at all the old trains, for a grand total of £1.7 each. And to make it better, we were the only ones there. They do actually have a train graveyard nearby, which these ones were taken from, but these were all in slightly better nick than the others. So they decided to make a train museum out of them. Jack then pretended to drive every train, while I found a little reminder of home. They also had this weird museum at the end, which started with some unique pots, and then saw a random bunch of skulls and skeletons. Jack then insisted that we went back inside so we could push this train by hand. There you go. By this point I was ready to leave, so we headed back to the accommodation via some more old train carriages and quite a lot of litter at the sides of the roads, and headed to bed early, ready for an early morning the next day.
The next morning we began our 3-day tour of the Uyuni salt flats, and the fantastic news for Beth was that we were starting at the train graveyard. Bolivia, which is a mineral-rich country, aimed to use Uyuni as a transport hub to ship its exports to the coast. Unfortunately, this didn't go completely to plan, leading to lots of trains and the railway infrastructure being abandoned and left to rust in the middle of the desert, which many years on turned out to be great for tourism, as it left behind a big techno-space playground for stupid tourists like me to climb around on, and lots of old railway tracks to photograph. After Beth was finished enjoying the trains, we jumped back in our Toyota Land Cruiser and headed to the salt refinery, where we were taught all about farming the salt and how all the salt in Bolivia contains no iodine. Therefore, to sell it, it has to be added, which seems quite inconvenient. We were then shown by our guide how each bag of salt was packaged by hand, which it turned out he was not particularly good at doing. So after he'd left, Beth had to go at the same thing. And it turned out if she was ever looking for a career in the salt industry, she'd found her niche. We were given some time after to look at the surrounding shops, which for Beth meant feeding the stray dogs, and gained her a big following with all the local strays. We then took a look at some of the local buildings, whose bricks were made completely of salt, and the changes in colour in each block, each represented a different season. Once we were done at the refinery, it was time to head out onto the salt flats, and our driver had quite an unusual selection of music for the journey. first stop was to see these vents from an underground river. Sadly, it was just bubbling cold water, but for the Bolivian people it was a big plus, as the briny water ended up indicating a huge source of lithium stored underneath the salt flats, which would be a handy source of income considering the current state of affairs in the country. We had a bit of time to attempt some jumping photographs, which I ended up having to film because I wasn't very good at taking them. Then it was off out into the nothingness of the salt flats, which cover an area of 4,000 square miles. They're so vast and flat, NASA actually uses it to calibrate its satellites. We stopped off in our van in the absolute middle of nowhere, which was a perfect opportunity to do some more jumping photos and use the vast empty area to take some great perspective photos with the salt flats token dinosaur. Oh, and this other one with a massive bottle of wine. After we'd taken in the sheer size and emptiness of the salt flats, we jumped back in our vehicle and headed for Cactus Island, which is actually the very top of a large prehistoric volcano. Since this whole area used to be under the sea, the whole peak is primarily made of coral and is covered in these massive cactuses thought to be hundreds of years old. We headed up to the very top of the island, where every year ceremonial offerings were left for our good old friend Pachamama. Then we made our way back down, back into the Jeep, ready to go and watch the sunset over some of the small lakes that still existed on the salt flats. From the warm temperatures in the daytime, the temperature started to decrease rapidly. And once the sun had set, it was time to head to our accommodation for the first night, where the walls, beds and floors were all surprisingly made of salt, which wasn't great if you had to go for a wee in the middle of the night.
Today we woke up early, packed the car up and headed straight on the road. And the first stop we made was in the middle of absolutely nowhere. We were in the Chiguana salt flats, where this old train track ran all the way through it. And trains do still run on here, but unfortunately they're not passenger trains, so we couldn't have a go on it.
Oh, that's actually quite good, well done.
Then we stopped off at this place to look at some rocks, I guess, because there wasn't really much else there. But they did have llama burgers, which were actually very tasty. Then we headed to several small lakes, including Cañapa, Hedionda and Chiacota, and in these lakes there were tons of flamingos. So we stayed for a good 40 minutes while Jack took loads of good pictures, and I took lots of mediocre videos. Then we had lunch here overlooking one of the lakes, which was just stunning, and then continued further south, passing through some beautiful landscapes, and this family of wild vicuñas on the way. Then we stopped off to see these things, which we've seen a couple of times already. They're not rabbits, they're not squirrels, they're viscachas, and they're actually related to chinchillas, and they're native to the Andes Mountains. And they've blatantly been fed by too many tourists, because they come right up to you. Then we carried on driving through the Siloli Desert, where we stopped off at this famous landmark, Arbol de Piedra, or the stone tree, which has been carved entirely by wind erosion over the years. But the wind was ridiculous, so we got out of there quick. The next stop was the spectacular Laguna Colorada, which was a lovely red lagoon. And here we got to see 3 different species of flamingo. And then it was back in the car, continuing to Guayajara, where we slept for the night.
Our final stop in Bolivia was seeing a field of geysers, which apart from the egg smell were really nice because it was freezing that morning. We then headed to border control because it was time to finally enter Chile. So over the 3 days we'd started in Uyuni, travelled across the salt flats and finished our tour in Chile, where the views of the Atacama Desert were pretty impressive. Well, I thought they were pretty impressive, but Beth just laid there in a borderline coma as the world went by, mainly because I'd passed on to her the illness that I had recently been carrying. Our plans that day were to go stargazing in the evening. Due to a sudden sandstorm, all the trips for the day were cancelled, so we had a stroll into town to get a quick snack, then had an early night due to Beth's debilitating illness.
I'll see you.